Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project, and I'm joined as always by my colleague Joshua Blank. Today we're going to focus on the just released University of Texas Politics Project poll, which we designed and implemented with our colleagues at YouGov. At the top of the agenda for that poll, I suppose, Josh, there's no getting around it, was the presidential election.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think, we always look at the timing of these things and where it fits in the political calendar. And if we're near a legislative session, we usually ask about a lot of policy questions that the legislature is going to take up. But in the June of an election year, right after the last primary had ended in the District of Columbia, our real focus on this was basically getting a sense of where Texans were, with respect to both the candidates in the presidential race, but also some of the issues that have been animating that discussion over the last, 6 months or so.
Right, and so we should talk about both of those. So let's start at the top, essentially not quite, but close to the top of the poll, and really the conceptual sort of heart of the poll. As you say, when we were thinking about this poll and writing the questions and designing it, the idea was we know the presidential election is happening. As you say, it's a certain time of year and a time in the cycle of how we poll. But there's also this sense that there are attitudes that are sort of intersecting at both the state level and in the presidential election. But nonetheless, the thing that most people were waiting for in terms of our audience. And
this is where we make our money.
And our desire to get the poll and to further the greater good of the University of Texas, what people were waiting for were the results in the presidential race, right?
Right. So we found that overall in a head-to-head matchup between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, 41% of registered voters in Texas said they'd be supporting Donald Trump, 33% said they'd be supporting Hillary Clinton. And the read of this broadly was Clinton's within single digits of Trump in Texas.
Right, and by single digits, just for people that don't live in this all the time, in other words, a lead of that she's only behind by less than 10 points. And we also had 19% in that matchup that said they preferred someone else, and then 8% said they didn't know. We also then followed up in the way that we organized the poll with a question that included the Libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson, and this is maybe one of Josh's least favorite topics. If you were in the studio, you could see him. It's a poker face, but it's barely.
I can't help but make this face every time we talk about this.
So in the three-way race, there wasn't a whole lot of impact by including Johnson. Donald Trump had 39%. Hillary Clinton drops a point to 32%. Johnson gains 7%. Most of that gain, on the face of it, comes from the people that had said someone else. So the someone else reading drops from 19 to 14 when you include the Libertarian candidate. And we should just say, for people that are looking for an alternative to the two-party system, there is, a lot of talk, shall we say, about Gary Johnson and then this third-party candidacy. We often, libertarians almost always are on the ballot in Texas at the presidential level and actually field some candidates in legislative races. But the typical pattern, and this is, the source of frustration, I'm teasing you, but I feel it too, which is we put a libertarian in, they always get more like clockwork. They always get more in the poll than they wind up getting in the final tally once the election rolls around. And so it only makes it look like we're that much further off if we include the Libertarian and then the Libertarian doesn't get any votes. I think Gary Johnson got a little less than 2%.
I think 1.4.
Yeah, 1.4% in the last general election when he ran in 2012. We know it's going to happen, but fair is fair, so we did do the matchup.
The one interesting thing about this, actually, I should say, I'll throw this out there, is just I think, given how negatively both Trump and Clinton are viewed both by, partisans of the other side, but also to some degree
within their own
parties, there was the possibility that you'd see, a surge in support for an alternative candidate. And really, if anything, this is actually a little bit lower than usual. I mean, usually we'd expect to see about 10% this far out for the Libertarian candidate and expect it to drop to less than 2% on Election Day. In this case, he only polled 7%. So, despite that narrative, it's really, there's no there.
I like the way you said that it was reasonable to do it, but then came back around to, but still I'm right to feel this way.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so that gives you a sense of what it looked like overall. And then there were interesting storylines. So when we put this poll together, if you step back, there's nobody out there that received this poll as an interested consumer who looked at these numbers and, wow, that's shocking. Donald Trump's ahead by 8 points. It's in the ballpark of what we expected. Very similar to where the Romney-Obama race was 4 years ago. Interestingly enough, that may just be a coincidence, but I think it's not, completely irrelevant.
Can we pause on that point for 1 second? I've been thinking about this a little bit because, on the one hand, you'd say, I think what, a lot of the coverage has been to point out that this is single digits. And the obvious response sort of from someone who follows this stuff regularly is to say exactly what you said, right? Well, when we polled in May 2012, Romney was ahead of Barack Obama by 8 points. So really, we should expect that gap to widen. Having said that, there are some differences, right?
Well, certainly.
Which is, yes, there's certainly some differences. I'm going to hone in on one minor difference. And the minor difference is that Romney hadn't actually secured the nomination at that point. And so to the extent that you'd expect to see Romney's vote share grow from that 8-point lead early on, a lot of that would be the consolidation you'd expect to happen once he became the nominee. And it was clear to everybody that this was the candidate. And you see that sort of rallying that if you've been kind of following politics over the last few weeks and since the primaries have closed out, you've been hearing about, especially with, Sanders voters sort of coming to Clinton and whether, Cruz and these other supporters are going to come to Trump, which we're going to talk some more about. But, in this case, actually, at this point in polling, the primary was over in Texas. The nominees were set, and so actually, even though this 8 points is comparable to the historical numbers, the context is a little bit different. You would, I think, with a more traditional, we'll say, Republican candidate, maybe expect this gap to be wider, given the fact that you expect Republicans to generally win in statewide elections by double digits.
Right. I think there's a countervailing tendency there. There is the fact that Romney wasn't quite the presumptive candidate as of June, though I think he was leading the pack by then.
He was definitely the leader of the pack.
But on the other hand, at this point, Trump is a bit more of a divisive candidate, well, to put it gently.
That's a good segue.
So what we cared about in a lot of ways, the reason I started on, this wasn't a huge surprise, was that we were interested in, after very divisive primaries, how much each candidate was consolidating support, given that, on the Republican side, you had Ted Cruz making a real run at Donald Trump.
Right, Texas Senator Ted Cruz.
For a long time. And certainly on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders has been giving Secretary of State Clinton a pretty good run for her money and is lingering in a way that is causing some degree of discontent. I think that, both of these then were factors that we were interested in. Put most simply, how much were the Cruz supporters coming around to support Trump? How much are the Sanders supporters coming around to support Clinton? Two very different answers.
Right. So we asked respondents, who they supported in the primary, and among Cruz supporters, 69% said that they were going to be supporting Donald Trump in the general election. Not surprisingly, 2% said they'd be supporting Hillary Clinton. And you may say, who are those 2%? That's like a good gut check on any poll. Nothing's ever 100%. If you don't have a couple people who are confused or messing up in some way.
You'd be more troubled by 0 than 2.
I would be much more troubled by 0 than 2. So again, Cruz supporters, about 70% of them said that they are coming to Donald Trump and they're going to vote for him. 22% said someone else. Among Sanders supporters, it's a little bit more mixed.
A little uglier over there.
A little uglier. 10% said they were supporting Donald Trump. 40% said they were going to support Clinton. 44%, the plurality, said they were going to support someone else.
And that 44 is a highlighted red number in many ways. Now, on one hand, given events and given the way that Senator Sanders has played this, that is, his reluctance to throw in the towel and unambiguously endorse Hillary Clinton in the last week or week and a half. He said that he was going to vote for her.
He's going to vote for her.
But he did not stand up and tell his supporters, I am going to vote for her. You should too. We are standing down. It's time to unify the party. We're not hearing that kind of message from Sanders. And his reluctance, or, I guess we have to call it his refusal to withdraw from the race, even though Clinton is the presumptive candidate, is clearly informing this number.
Yeah, and I think there's sort of somebody asked me this question. It's a smart question, which is can you look at this and say, hey, Clinton's only down by 8 right now, and again, it's early. These numbers are going to move. We expect that gap to expand over time. However, 44% of Sanders supporters, which is about 20% of the people we polled, say they're voting for someone else. I mean, presumably, a lot of them are going to come to Clinton at some point, right? Doesn't that give her room to grow? And my response to that was, well, if you sort of do the math, so do, multiply percentages by percentages and everything, really you're talking about 7.5% of the overall electorate.
Right.
Okay. So that could clear, basically actually cover, it would be helpful to cover some of that gap. At the same time, what's been notable about Sanders supporters in a lot of ways is
they're dug in.
They're dug in, and they also skew younger.
Right, which means they're going to skew to lower turnout.
Right.
And so there's going to be attrition there.
And it's not going to go 100% to Clinton,
right,
even those who do show up. So, it's an interesting question. I think there's a lot in this poll and early on, I think, that indicates maybe a closer race in Texas than we think. Not a competitive race.
Right.
But a closer race.
Well, and I think the other thing, you said this at the outset, and I keep reminding people of this, it's June.
Right.
We still have a bunch of, sort of stimulators of public opinion shifts. There's still a lot of consolidation to go. There's still a lot of people that aren't paying close attention, probably most people. And so there's a lot of shifts. Now, on the Republican side, something a little, it would seem similar in that Ted Cruz has not endorsed Donald Trump and has given every signal that he has no intention of ever doing so. And I think that's unlike Sanders, frankly.
Right.
I think Sanders will eventually come around.
I think so, too.
But with Cruz, he's made it clear, the stories say, he's not going to, that he is not going to respond to Donald Trump's requirement that he endorse Trump in order to speak at the convention. He's like,
which is actually unenforceable.
Yeah, we'll go, but we're not going. And I don't care if we speak. Basically, they're not going to do it. Nonetheless, there's a higher level of support for Trump among Cruz voters than there was among Sanders voters for Clinton. Right, 69%.
Right, 69%. Right.
So 69%, are on board, suggesting that, in one sense, at least as far as these candidate kind of rivalries, the Republicans don't have much of a problem in Texas, and we'll see this in some of the other attitudinal stuff. Texas Republicans, by and large, are coming around to Trump's candidacy, but they're doing so in a way that, still is happening in the context, and maybe even because of a lot more kind of structural division and tension inside the party. And we see that when we look at these approval numbers of the major parties among their partisans.
Right. So, if you think about the fact that you had this divisive primary season and, at the very least, maybe Cruz supporters are not happy with the process. Clearly Sanders supporters are not happy with the process. But when you actually ask, these supporters how they feel about the Republican and Democratic parties respectively, Bernie voters are, pretty much, I would say, relatively ambivalent towards the Democratic Party, right?
Right. The Sanders, the people that say they supported Sanders in the primary have 44% have a favorable view of the Democratic Party, 36% an unfavorable. Now that's not great, but it's it's not the end of the world either. But if you compare that to Clinton voters, people that say they're voting for Clinton have a 75% approval of the Democratic favorable view of the Democratic Party and only 9% negative. If you look then at the Republican side, it's much more complicated. Cruz voters, again, have a net positive, favorable view of the Republican Party, 45 favorable, 36 unfavorable. But Trump voters who have just triumphed and whose candidate has presumably just triumphed in the process, themselves only have 50 favorable, 31 unfavorable. So really, at best, only about half of Republicans have a favorable view of their own party.
Right. I mean, it's actually, we're looking specifically at subsets of voters, but that does obscure, it doesn't obscure, but actually a little bit, the bigger trend, which is, Democrats overall in Texas, 73% have a favorable view of the Democratic Party. Okay, good. Republicans in Texas, only 52% have a favorable view of the Republican Party. Almost 30% have an unfavorable view of their own party.
Right.
So, I mean, we sort of were talking about this a little bit earlier. I mean, in some ways, this is a lot of what the primary was about and how it ended up sort of shaking out, right? These sort of long-time kind of party guys, the Jeb Bushes, the John Kasichs, right? They didn't gain much traction. And then the two guys who were left standing were the two people who were the most critical of the party from the get-go, Donald Trump and Ted Cruz.
Most bluntly, Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, who were the last two men standing, spent almost as much time kind of, taking punches at their own party as they did the Democrats.
Right. So, you can see how now both sides are...
And they found an audience, clearly.
Right. And so both sides are facing sort of different kinds of challenges right now. Right. With the Democrats, it's classic, right? It's, how do you incorporate the losing candidate's supporters back into the party? The truth is, it shouldn't be that hard because overall, they, generally, Democrats have a positive view of the Democratic Party. There's generally agreement about these sorts of issues, the issues that animate the Democratic Party, they're going to kind of come back over. With the Republicans, this sort of, structural distrust of institutions, including the party itself, is really baked into the cake. And that makes it difficult to sort of
rally around the label, in a sense, right? I mean, if you're somebody that's used to, if the idea is the parties provide a degree of cohesion and a point of identification for voters that help the candidates, it's hard to look at these numbers and not feel like the Republicans are going to have less of that. Now, in Texas, two things I think to keep in mind here. One, quickly, in Texas, there's just so many more Republicans than there are Democrats that actually show up to vote on Election Day in terms of what we, in highfalutin terms, call the composition of the electorate. Because Republican turnout is so much higher than Democratic turnout, and there's just so many Republicans. This would have to get really bad for us to start thinking that Hillary Clinton was going to take this thing. The other piece of this is that there's another piece to the puzzle, and that is the antipathy that people in their party, no matter how much they are skeptical or not of their own party, there's this deep antipathy towards the opposing candidates that we also tested in what was motivating people's votes.
Right. It's important. This is so when we look at Clinton, Hillary Clinton's, favorability numbers, among Republicans, she's viewed unfavorably by 91% of Republicans. 86% of Democrats view Trump unfavorably.
And if you drill down into those numbers, the vast majority of those are not just unfavorable, they're very unfavorable. The thing I always imagine is that when we are asking people about these questions, the person taking the poll on their computer is just like slamming at the mouse so they can go, oh, very unfavorable. And when we ask people really directly about this, what do we get? We ask people, so once they express their preference, we said, are you voting? So is your vote mainly a vote for Donald Trump or mainly a vote against Hillary Clinton? And then we did the same reverse with Clinton voters. Among Trump voters, 45% said that their vote was mainly for Trump, 55% against Clinton.
Right, and 57% of Republicans.
Right, and so on, and then among Clinton voters overall, 57% said that they were voting for Clinton, 43 against Trump. So there's I think we're seeing a little bit more of that positive affect among Democrats evident in that number, but the against votes in that are both pretty high.
Right, exactly. These things all this is sort of reinforcing actually in a way that, uniquely it kind of, it's unique in the sense that it's not classic, but it actually is pushing us to the same point, which is even if I'm not excited about my candidate, I'm so against the alternative that we're still going to see a lot of sort of normal partisan voting kind of across the election.
There's people are going to be pretty locked into their party candidates. I think we're not going to see a lot of movement. The question is, how does it affect turnout? All right, before we get too far in the weeds, let's talk a little bit before we sign off. We're running long probably about issues. We looked at a set of issues that, as we said, we thought were intersecting the national conversation, but also in some cases have been very prominent in Texas. So we asked a battery of questions about immigration and found not too many surprises in that, I don't think.
Right. It's not surprises to us, maybe to you, but we'll let you know. So one, we ask a regular question about whether undocumented immigrants, currently living in the U.S. should be deported immediately. This is sort of goes back to kind of the Mitt Romney, we're going to deport 11 million people, and I think Donald Trump has sort of, waved at this as a possibility. Overall in Texas, 50% of registered voters approve or agree with this sort of approach of immediate deportation, 42% disapprove. Among Republicans, it's 73% saying in approval, 23% against. Donald Trump's proposal to build a border wall between the U.S. and Mexico. Again, very similar numbers. 52% of Texans, support this idea, 40% oppose it. Among Republicans, 76% support it, 17% oppose it. And then, a ban on non-citizen Muslims from entering the U.S. On this one, again, similar. 52% overall in support, 37% opposed, 76% of Republicans approve, 16% opposed. And this actually went up a lot. We asked the same item about sort of a ban on Muslim immigration back in February, and it was 63% of Republicans. So it's jumped up 13 points during that period. Now, some of that is no doubt due to the Orlando shooting, even though, he was a citizen and all that. But, we don't need...
I think that probably fed it. But, when I step back and look at all these in an ensemble, it's a lot of partisan, we didn't give any of the Democratic numbers. The Democratic numbers are almost the complete mirror image in all of these. So on the border wall, for example, Democrats only 21% support, 72% oppose. So I think a couple of things here. One, the frame of the discussion in the presidential election is reinforcing tendencies that we've seen in Texas long before Donald Trump, strode off his reality set and onto the political stage.
We get asked a lot about, explain how this is Donald Trump's fault that people have these restrictive immigration views. And the answer is, well, no, Trump has benefited from these views, but they existed long before, his success in the primaries.
Right. He is exploiting them in a more direct way and not attempting to balance other interests in the party, I think, in a way that we have become familiar with in Texas, in which political leaders have done that. So another issue quickly that we talked about was transgender access to public facilities and bathrooms. We found similar degree of partisan structure in there, not quite as polarized, but pretty close.
Yeah, I think the first thing we want to ask,
actually about as polarized, really.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say as polarized, actually.
Well, Democrats are a little more divided, but Republicans are pretty...
Well, right, the Republican structure is the same. I think there's two things we were sort of interested in with this issue. Is one, we kind of want to do a heat check. Elected officials have been talking about this stuff a lot over the last couple of months.
And just to be direct, Dan Patrick has been all over this. The lieutenant governor in Texas has really rolled the dice. And, I had a reporter talking to me a few weeks ago that had I think sort of a semi off the record with the lieutenant governor who came away, the reporters saying, it really feels like Dan Patrick views this as him standing up to the president of the United States. It's him versus Obama.
Okay. Well, I think from my perspective, not having spoken with the lieutenant governor, I was sort of wondering, is this, is he out on a limb here? Is this a misfire on his part? Is it a reach? And the results kind of show probably not. It seemed that overall, 50% of Texans said that they were very or somewhat concerned about, transgender public facility access. But, like the immigration numbers, that included, 66% of Republicans. And then across sort of a couple different issues, should transgender individuals have access to public restrooms based on their birth gender or their gender identification? Should transgender students, have access to, public school facilities based on their birth gender or their gender identity? 75% of Republicans basically said birth gender. It was very clear and unequivocal. With Democrats, it's a little bit more mixed. With respect to, access to public restrooms, 29% of Democrats said birth gender, 50% said gender identity. And these, results kind of held across the items. And I think that's kind of why you see it's such a good issue for Republicans, is that they're concerned about it and they're very clear. Whereas for Democrats, it's not exactly clear in a state like Texas how you respond. because you know that about a third of your voters actually would disagree with you if you
Right.
took the gender identity route, which is why you probably haven't heard too much from Texas Democrats on this issue.
But another reason we ask this now is that so we can follow this. I mean, my suspicion is that as this issue takes more shape and as the politics of it become more public, we'll see a little bit of movement. So I think with that, speaking of movement, we're going to move out of here.
If you want to check out these results, any others, you can go to the Texas Politics Project website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu, and we have, all these
more
results.
More stuff than you can possibly
you
digest in a setting. There'll be a link to latest poll. There's also a link to the blog where we've written up some of this stuff if you want to have a look. So with that, thanks for listening, and we will see you next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project and the Project 2021 Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin.